To the 29th seminar of the Global South PhD in Progress Seminar Series Phase 3. I would like to thank the organizer of this weekly seminar series, Dr. Nauman Reayat, lecturer in law, the Global South Network, of today's session. His research interests lie within the area of constitutionalism and judicial independence, rule of law, and judicial populism in developing democracies. I will chair today's session. I'm Khanyisela Moyo, and I'm lecturer at the School of Law, University of Ulster. My research and teaching interests are in post-colonial transitions, criminal law, gender, human rights, and transitional justice. Number of leading journals. I'm also a member of the editorial board of the State Practice and International Law Journal, with an additional specialized responsibility of book review editor. Our peer commentator for today is Yusuf Sulayman, who is a PhD at the University of Portsmouth. He is a lawyer with over 8 years of experience in teaching and practicing in Nigeria. He specializes in helping clients resolve a variety of issues from corporate to property and election disputes. His CV is quite impressive. I'm not going to go through it. But last but not least, our guest speaker for today is Natalia Morales Cerda, who is a PhD student and postgraduate teaching assistant in public law at University College London. Her PhD research project contributes to the literature on women's political representation and participation in constitution making through examining the 2021 to 2022 Chilean Constituent Process. Adopting a theoretically informed socio-legal methodology, her research critically assesses women's direct participation in constituent processes in both democratic and feminist theory. Through this examination, her research also provides a feminist critique of the crisis of democratic representation. Natalia has been a visiting scholar at 2 universities in Chile. Natalia will today present her project titled Political Representation in Contemporary Constitutional Democracies. What can we learn from women's involvement in the Chilean constitution-making process? Natalia, you have 30 to 35 minutes for the presentation, which will be followed by 5 minutes for comments or questions of dissent and a peer commentator, and 15 minutes of questions and an answer session by attendees. The floor is now yours, Natalia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you very much for the invitation to present my PhD research here. Probably I'm going to take less than 35 minutes because I'm certainly more interested in to hear comments and questions. So I'm more interested in the discussion that we can have here. So the idea of this paper, it is connected to my PhD research. In general terms, overall, my PhD research, the idea of my PhD research is to rethink the idea of political representation in today's constitutionalist democracy. And I do so by looking at a case study, a particular case study, which is the Chilean Constitution-Making Process, which took place a couple of years ago. And something that is important to have in mind for my research is that my goal or my purpose is not to think specifically about women's specific mechanisms of representation, but to incorporate gender as an analytical category when conceptualizing political representation. So it's slightly different, but I think it's really important to have in mind is that my goal is not to think about particular mechanisms, in order to conduct women's political representation, as we usually think about in gender parities or gender quotas. My idea is different than that. My idea is to conceptualize political representation thinking from a gender perspective, or thinking about gender as an analytical category that may allow to think or to theorize political representation in a different way. So this paper is part of my PhD research, but it's not exactly my PhD research, and the main difference is the data I'm working on. In my PhD, I am working with interviews with the women members of the convention. I did 25 interviews with members of the convention. I did 25 interviews with members of the convention. I did the interviews in a particular period, in a 2-month period, which was after the end of the sessions of the convention and before the referendum that we had in Chile that at the end rejected the draft of the new constitution. So it's a particular period. I think it's a particular period to do the interviews. It was a particular period to do the interviews, and I had a reason, a theoretical reason to do that. But in this paper, I do not intend to work with that data, but I will be probably looking in particularly at the speeches of women, members of the convention, and perhaps particularly those speeches that they delivered at the installation of the convention. I think that there is an important set of data, an important set of, and a very interesting approach and very interesting information that we can get listening and reading the speeches that the members of the convention delivered in the installation of the convention. So I think I will probably looking at that data and not interviews. So the work I am presenting, it's based or is related to 3 ideas. The first one is that the case of Chile, the Chilean Constitution-Making Process, and more generally speaking, the constitutional tradition in Chile challenge the element of presence in the standard account of political representation. The second idea is that critical citizens challenge the element of absence, again, in the standard narrative of political representation. Or to put it in another way, in the representative relationship as one of presence-absence, citizens today do not want to be absent, or they do not feel comfortable in the role of absence. And the third idea, or the third element, is that looking at how representation is done, it may be useful in overcoming this presence-absence dichotomy. So, as a starting point, I draw on Hannah Pitkin's idea of political representation, which is representation means making present something which is absent, something which is nevertheless not literally present. This idea of representation is the dominant idea of political representation in today's constitutional democracies, particularly in relationship with the electoral representation today. And more or less the same can be said when we look at feminist literature. Most of feminist literature it's based on descriptive representation and substantive representation, and the idea of politics of presence from Anne Phillips. When you look at the literature, the feminist literature, trying to incorporate the gender component on political representation, most of literature is working on the same framework of making present something that is absent. And from there, the design of gender parities or gender parity policies or gender quotas, particularly in Latin American countries, have been developed. And actually, when we look at the Chilean constitution-making process, from this conception of political representation, presence became a standard of political legitimacy and a particular mechanism for overcoming inequalities when talking about gender. So when you look at the Chilean process, when you look at the Chilean constitutional tradition, presence as a key element of political representation seems to be the key element for legitimacy and the key element to overcome inequalities. And this was actually the normative ground for the debate and for the adoption of gender parity in the Chilean constitution-making process. All the discourses from academia, from politicians, from activists was structured and was based on in terms of descriptive representation and substantive representation, which is a kind of standard framework when discussing political representation. Actually, when you look at the Chilean process, something that's particularly interesting in this process is that we had a diversity of presence, different presences, including gender parity principle, reserved seats for indigenous people, a 5% quota of party candidates for people with disabilities, a particular mechanism for involvement of independent candidates. So the process was designed in order to have different presences in the constitution-making process. And actually, based on these elements, the process was celebrated for the diversity of presences. However, the Constitutional Convention failed to represent the Chilean population. On September 2022, the proposed draft for the new constitution was rejected in a referendum. So despite the diversity of presences, despite of this idea of political legitimacy that we had in mind in order to design the process based on gender quotas, based on quotas for indigenous communities, based on the gender parity, apparently this failed in order to provide quality, in a sense, for political representation. So the argument I'm trying to make here is that despite the massive presence, there was not political representation in the Chilean constitution-making process. But let's see the other element or the other argument, the second element of the argument I'm trying to make here. Again, keeping in mind the idea that to represent is to make present something that is absent. Okay, this is the key idea of the standard account of political representation. But in how citizens engage with politics today, it seems to me that they challenge also the idea of the element of presence. This means that in the representative relationship as one of presence absence, and how we try to find a balance between presence and absence, citizens do not feel comfortable in the role of absentee. Citizens do not believe in institutions and distrust mediation. But this does not lead individuals, or this doesn't mean that individuals or that citizens wants to leave politics. And actually, I will say it is totally the opposite. These citizens have a long list of things that they want to change. And we can see that, and we saw that in the protest surrounding the constitution making process in Chile. Educational system, pensions, the climate crisis, gender inequality. This, for me, shows that they are what Pippa Norris calls critical citizens. They value democracy as an ideal, but they are disconnected or disaffected, dissatisfied with the performance of the political system overall. And actually, in Chile, critical citizens has been on the rise. There has been a massive wave of protest since, at least, actually, it is possible to find a connection between the protests which started in 2011 and then the wave of protests that started in 2018, which is the kind of the feminist protest that started in 2018, and then probably the most famous one, which was immediately before the constitution making process in 2019. In October 2019, that wave of protest at the end paved the road for the constitution making process. And actually, this picture is one of the iconic pictures of the 2019 protest in Santiago, which is the capital of Chile. So the argument here is that as citizens do not believe in institutions and distrust mediation, but they don't want to abandon politics, critical citizens do not feel comfortable being absent in the idea of political representation. And actually, the persistence of absence, it has a risk. Because at the end, and I think it's something that we can say about the Chilean process, the persistent absence make it possible for the citizens to try to separate altogether from the politics, or from the political system in general. And I think that this cannot make a case in order to also consider absence as a problematic element in political representation. This means that despite that we have been theorizing mainly about the presence and political representation, I am trying to make the argument to say that presence is important, but absence is also important to consider, and how we understand absence, what absence means for political representation. Is actually absence only, it's actually absence only not to be present, or absence could mean something else when we look at political representation in this context, in which I call contemporary political conditions. So, if presence failed, as the Chilean process shows, higher presence does not necessarily go hand in hand with a stronger or better representation, and absence is problematic in the current socio-political conditions. Let's say absence is not suitable for citizens today. Then, in this context, with these two elements, my argument is that looking at how representation is done could be useful to overcome the tensions or problems in both presence and absence, which are the central elements of the classic definition of political representation. But this approach has two assumptions. The first is that political representation is not a fact, is not a state of affairs, but political representation is a process or an event to be made or done. So it's not a particular moment. Political representation is actually a process, meaning that involves an ongoing relationship, but also involves different times in the relationship. And the second assumption is that what we humans do and how we do it, it depends on how we see ourselves and our context or our environment. This is one of the key elements of the feminist standpoint theory, the feminist standpoint approach, which is basically on the idea that experience, it is important in order to create knowledge. So based on those two assumptions, looking at women as representatives could provide useful or interesting insights on the concept of political representation today. And I do so by looking at the Chilean constitution-making process. The Chilean constitution-making process is the first in the world with gender parity in the constitution-making body. The Constitutional Convention, a full elected body, started their sessions in July 2021 and was working for 12 months. The gender parity mechanism, which was included in the election of the candidates before the election, meaning that the political parties had the obligation to include a party like the same number of male and female in the list of the candidates, but also was included in parity as a result, meaning that after the elections, we had a mechanism to correct, to correct the election in order to have the same number of male and females as a member of the convention, meaning that the convention was composed by 155 people, 77 of them identifying themselves as women. Yeah. Okay, so I think that we could talk a little bit more about the convention, but I think it's not necessary to go in that detail today, especially because I don't know, because of the time. But what I want to say here is that when looking at how the convention operated for 1 year, you can see that women adopted form of organization that were not the same by men. They tend to organize themselves in small groups. They tend to organize themselves inside of the convention, but also in coordination of spaces outside of the convention. And I am trying to look at that relationship in order to see the relationship among the members of the conventions and among the members of the convention, but also outside of the convention. When I say outside of the convention, I am looking particularly of the civil society organizations as an umbrella, which make it easier maybe to try to identify particular kind of relationships. But I will be also interested in looking at an organized civil society as well, because I think that it could be important to try to find some elements in an organized civil society as well. And I think that another element that may be interesting here, it's to think about how those kind of relationships were before being members of the convention, while they were members of the convention, meaning during the functioning of the convention, and after the work of the convention. This is also related with the idea that political representation is not a moment, but a process. And based on this, what I see for now, and I'm going to finish with this, is that there is a space that I think is not being properly considered from the perspective of political representation. And I think that this space is somehow how intersect presence and absence. or how presence or absent are presented as a continuum, not as two separate things. And I think that based on the experience of women members of the convention in a very particular context, with gender parity, with gender principle, in a very diverse setting, it is possible to identify some elements, or that is what I'm trying to do at least, to identify some elements to try to fill that space that I think actually exists between presence and absence, not as a two separate, completely separate things, but as a continuum. Because I think that the radical separation or that radical distinction between presence and absence and absence is something that is problematic today. It is, of course, something that I am still exploring. I think that there is a lot of information, a lot of data in the interviews as well. But as I said in this paper, I don't want to look at the interviews. I want to look at the speeches. But yeah, the idea is it's more or less the same. The idea of the continuum between presence and absence as something that the constitutional system today fails to capture, basically. So I think that that's everything on my side. It would be great to hear comments or questions, or maybe some concerns that may arise from this argument I am presenting here. Democratic concerns, maybe, methodological concerns as well. But yeah, thank you very much.
Oh. Thank you very much, Natalia, for your insightful presentation. I'll now hand over to our discussant, Dr. Nauman Reayat, for his comments or questions. Over to you, Nauman.
Thank you, Khanyisela, for chairing the session. Thanks, Yusuf, for agreeing to act as peer commentator. Thanks, Natalia, for accepting the invitation and deliver this interesting talk. And thanks all who are currently watching us. So I think it's a very important topic within the existing studies of constitutionalization of politics, constitution making, and judicial politics, mainly because most of the studies actually talk about constitution making and the aims and objectives of the political actors, legal actors. But your study is one of those few studies that are focusing on inclusion of gender to conceptualize political representation, if I repeat in your words. And I think it's a very important contribution to the existing studies. You rightly mentioned the general importance in the beginning, and I think that is the general importance of the study. So the study is currently focused on this Chile as a case study. But it does offer important insights, and the main research problem, I think, which I can see is one, that most of the many countries in the global south, they have this debate, and actually not only in the global south, it's in the global north as well. You know, the inclusion of women, gender parity, and its impact on constitutional identity, political representation. So the main idea is usually that you involve more and more women, because women are most of the time they constitute majority of population, and that will strengthen political representation. However, in Chilean case, there is gender parity, but that still is not working. And I think it's a very important problem. And it challenges the mainstream assumptions that if we create more political space, that will work. But the Chilean case is actually showing that it's not working. Another important problem which you highlighted, that it's not only about presence. So if something is present, that doesn't mean it's represented. that presence has to be effective, that presence has to be meaningful, and that can actually make things work. That is another important problem which I can see there. You did highlight in different ways, but you may wish to consider it, consider emphasizing this problem. Now the conceptualization. I mean, I have some few questions about. I think I have a lot of questions, but I will focus. I will prioritize all these questions. The first one is your conceptualization of political representation. I think you really need to think about two things. One, when it comes to constitution making process, the concept of legal representation and political representation, they most of the time they overlap. And I wonder if you thought about how to separate these two concepts, how to look at these two concepts in isolation from each other, or if you want to look at these two concepts in connection to each other, if it is possible to do so, and how you are going to meet that challenge, especially when you are thinking about including gender in order to conceptualize political representation concept. Now, the second thing, you did mention that the data which you're trying to use during the PhD is interviews, but for this particular section, you are actually relying on speeches delivered by, I guess, women activists or the leaders during the or the members of the Constitution Convention. I just wonder if the data is speeches, if that is the data you're solely relying upon. So usually this kind of data is used to develop narratives, to analyze, examine narratives, different themes. So basically it is, I just want to, I mean, I would be a bit careful to clarify if my aim is to do discourse analysis, or is some kind of a narrative analysis, or is the goal goes beyond this. The equation between presence, legitimacy, and representation, that was very interesting one. I think this is what you may wish to clarify, if the connection between these three things, presence, legitimacy, and representation, that needs to be very clear, because everything which is represented doesn't need to be legitimate, and everything legitimate doesn't need to be representative. We can see these kind of cases in many authoritarian states. Many groups are represented, but they are not legitimate. I can give many examples, Asian examples, Middle Eastern examples, where many groups are represented, but they are not legitimate, or their political legitimacy or legal legitimacy is questionable. So you may wish to think about the connection between these three concepts. Now, another interesting concept which you just mentioned, the differentiation, is the descriptive representation and substantive representation. I wonder if you could clarify this difference between these two kinds of representations. Another concept which you discussed was about critical citizenship, and I was thinking, what is distinctive? How does this concept, the way this concept operate in case of Chile, is different from other countries? Like if we talk about protest, Egypt, right now Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Philippines, Singapore, South Korea, a lot of protests take place. Nigeria is another example. But can we say all of them are critical citizens? Or there's a difference between critical citizens and informed, responsible critical citizens? So I was just wondering if this is what you thought about or not. political representation as a process. So that is also very important. I mean, when you keep on mentioning that you want to look at these things as a process and as a continuum. So I wonder if when it is a process as a continuum, so the underlying assumption is that it is a means to achieve other objectives, and it is not an end itself. So political representation is not something which you achieved and that's it. There always be some ends which you want to achieve, and if those ends are achieved, then there will be another debate that more or less. So, for example, political representation has been achieved. So the next step is, should there be more representation or should there be less? So I wonder if you thought about that when you try to present as these concepts as a process and continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nauman. Natalia, I just wonder if you want to comment or respond to what Nauman has said before we move on to the commentator, peer commentator.
Well, there are many questions, so I don't know if we will have time for that. Maybe I will take the other comment questions and then try to reply all together.
Put together, yeah, and then you can respond collectively. That would be great.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's fine. So I'm just checking with the attendees if any questions or comments before we move on to the peer commentator. Nothing. So I will assume no one wants to. So I'll move on to the peer commentator. Over to you, Yusuf.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Nauman, for inviting me. Natalia, I appreciate your presentation. It's a very interesting one, and I am particularly impressed by the fact that you have chosen the hard way for research, because this looks kind of original to me, and of course you encounter a lot of questions because of that. I want to believe it's going to be very useful in the end. So many of my questions, I'm happy Nauman made his comment before me, because many of my questions or comments really have been addressed by Nauman. My questions were in between your methodology, particularly not the whole of your methodology really, but the decision to use speeches by members who are already by females who are already members of the Constitutional Convention. So just trying to see, because already qualitative data or research has its subjective deficiency already. So by the time you now focus on those who already are members of the convention, would that really represent why citizens are opposed to the products in the end? I'm wondering if the views of those who are members of the convention would actually represent why people are opposed to it, which talks to the theory of absence, really. I also, so that's one of my concerns, and I was also wondering the focus, like you mentioned, you said it's a continuum, a process. So it's really not, or is maybe this is a question, it's really not about parity, really. It's really about the impact of parity or non-parity on the eventual product, the constitution itself. And I see this as focusing so much, because you said you are using the normative angle, which looks like the sociological perspective to constitutional legitimacy, if I get it correctly. There could be so many reasons, as I see, for citizens to oppose a particular product: legal perspectives, moral perspectives that may not necessarily attribute to the sociological angle, really. So that's my concern. Like, the focus really is on the sociological perspective. This may not necessarily explain why there is why it's not getting acceptance, really. So these are my concerns, but on a whole, I think it's an interesting stuff, especially the conflict of presence. I also wanted to mention, because Norman has captured that definition of terms, because it was a bit difficult to grapple with some of these things, presence, absence, and in fact, who is a critical citizen, because these are really subjective ideas. Who is a critical citizen? How do you in fact identify critical citizens? Whose view amounts to rejection? Is it, like he mentioned, just because people protest? Some protests might not necessarily relate to parity or gender or even representation. It might relate to so many other things in terms of the other perspectives to constitutional legitimacy. So these are just my observations. If you would want to address them. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'll allow Natalia to go. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yusuf. I'm just wondering from the attendees if there's anyone who has a burning question before Natalia addresses what has been said by the commentator, the discussant. We have Roman.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, just very quickly, I'm curious because this is it seems like very important research about a very important event in Chile socially and historically. Whether you could say a word or two about how you're gonna, like you talked about it, it's a very diverse society, and there's different levels of political engagement as well and interest in these sort of topics. How do you do to sort of divulge your research with the population in general, like whether you have like ways of getting to different parts of society, to people maybe who have a strong interest in politics and others who maybe a bit less are plugged into the whole political debate and so on. So that would be very interesting for me, but just if you have time. Thanks.
Thanks, Roman. Any other question before we allow Natalia to address the questions? There was another question in the chat, I think, whether it was a question or a comment from Ali. Did you see that one, Natalia? In the chat from Ali?
Okay, I can see the question.
Yeah, so if you can respond to those comments and questions, please, and then we take 2 more questions before we close.
Okay,
just
yeah.
before Natalia, you respond to the questions, I just want to clarify. I can understand it. There are many questions and many comments, and it might be overwhelming for you. So please feel free to prioritize the question and your responses. We won't mind that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there are many questions, but also related to each other. So I'm gonna try. I will do my best to try to say something about all of them. Well, so on the conceptualization of political representation and legal representation, which were one of the first questions. Yeah, I don't use the idea of concept of legal representation. I haven't think about it. I don't know if it's yeah, no, I haven't. I think something that may be connected is that I think it's different to think about political representation in ordinary politics, let's say, than thinking political representation in constitution-making processes. I think that maybe trying to focus on that idea on why political representation it is different, or what are those particularities on political representation in a particular setting, which is constitution making processes. I think that may be useful to make a distinction between representation in ordinary politics on constitution making processes in general as a different setting. The question on data, which it was mentioned, both of the commentators. Yeah, I know that there are some risks involved in working with the speeches. I think, and also I can see the challenges of working with discursive analysis or narrative analysis. I haven't decided yet. And these concerns, maybe the concerns that you are making, and here that maybe it's gonna lead me to work with the interviews. Maybe it's a better idea to try to focus on the interviews. But yeah, that's interesting, and that's useful for me to think about. But also connected to that, why I am looking at the people who is actually present and not looking at the people who is absent, which is kind of the question of Yusuf. I think I'm doing this because what I want to understand from the feminist standpoint theory, from the feminist perspective, is I am trying to understand the concept of political representation from the perspective who is actually doing political representation based on the traditional idea of political representation, meaning that they were elected to work as representatives in a very particular context, which is this setting with gender parity and all the things that I described for the Chilean constitution-making process. So I want to look at their experiences. That is what I'm working, or I'm trying to look at how they identify themselves as representatives. It is actually interesting that during the interviews, most of them, they don't talk about themselves as representatives. They use different words. Oh, something important is that I did the interviews in Spanish, obviously. So translating the concepts could be tricky sometimes, but they don't talk about themselves as representatives. They talk about themselves as delegates sometimes, which is not exactly the same. Some of them actually talk about themselves as if they are the actual people there. Not, there is no like a mandate involved. No, they perceive themselves as the people present there. So yeah, there are some things that I think that's important to consider and to explain. I will have to explain that also in the paper and why I'm working with that experience. On the three concepts of presence, legitimacy, and political representation, and the connection between those three concepts, I think, well, as if we take the standard narrative of political representation today, political representation is conceived as legitimate as long as we increase the presence. Meaning that, for instance, from the gender perspective, as women were not present, then political representation was not legitimate enough in particular contexts, because we were absent from decision making, we were absent for in general in those forums, not only constitution making, but also in ordinary politics. What I'm trying to say is that presence is, even though it is important in order to legitimate political representation, contemporary political conditions shows that it cannot be the only element in order for political representation to be legitimate. So I know that I have to explain the connection between those three concepts. But what I'm trying to do from a different perspective is trying to think about political representation as legitimate, not only because of the element of presence. There must be another element. I think I'm gonna, well, the ideas of descriptive and substantive representation is on the classic or standard narrative of political representation, which is basically the idea of descriptive representation, this idea of representation as a mirror, as the members of the convention, in this case, they look at me and they look similar to me, okay, then there is sort of kind of representation. While substantive representation is this idea of there is a lot of discussions on the interest of women, particularly on how a particular outcome from what representation women means. For instance, the idea of including abortion, for instance, which has been a historical demand for feminist movements in Chile. It's possible to understand it from the framework of substantive representation. So we include in the draft of the Constitution this particular interest of women. And I think that also, I have just like 1 minute, so I want to say something about the critical citizens. I think that, yeah, you're right that I'm not saying that every time that we have massive protest, we can say that we have critical citizens. I think that particularly in the Chilean context, it is possible to frame it from the critical citizens perspective for two reasons, maybe. The first one is our tradition from after 17 years of a dictatorship. And it was a dictatorship, but also with a strong component of neoliberalism, meaning that which at the end was related in the idea that citizens were not involved that much in politics in general, meaning that the approach for citizens to social to social ideas were more based on individual aspects of relationship and not a collective view or not a. And I think that's not particularly for the Chilean case. It could be also other Latin American countries could be framed in a similar way. But I think that another element it's relevant to consider is that while Chileans became more distant from political parties and Congress, they were at the same time more willing to join forces through collective action, despite liberalism. And that's also connected in the Chilean case with how certain groups on the Chilean society were able to go to universities, were able to improve their socioeconomical situation. So we have a kind of increasing group of people involved in this kind of collective actions for the last 20 years, I will say. So I think that there are particular elements for the Chilean context that allows me to talk about or to frame the discussion as a critical citizenship. Well, I think that there are more questions, but I think I'm gonna leave it here because of the time.
Yeah.
So on that note, I'll just say thank you to everyone. Maybe we can clap hands for Natalia. Thank you for responding well to all these questions and for your excellent presentation. Thank you, Yusuf, for your comments and questions. And thanks to everyone for attending this session. I'd like to remind you that next week, Dua Bakda of Leicester Law School will present their project entitled The Effects of Adopting the Shareholder Private Corporate Governance Principle on the Financial Market in the Middle East and North America, 1903. So we look forward to having you all next week again. And many thanks to everyone who attended today's session. Thanks again, Natalia.
Thank you very
Goodbye.
much.
Thanks,
Thank you for the
thanks everyone.
invitation.
Look after yourself. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.